And what has been on my mind over the past week is the idea of well-being and how to find well-being through the Psalms, or rather what the Psalms tell us about well-being. And in the Psalms, you have wisdom literature. And wisdom in the Old Testament is concerned with well-being, is concerned with living. Wisdom is concerned with living well. So I thought we'd look at Psalm 139 and see what this psalm tells us in terms of our well-being. So turn with me to Psalm 139 and we'll read the psalm as far as verse 18. Now, we may tomorrow evening look at the conclusion of this psalm because the conclusion is very problematic. The closing verses of this psalm have caused a great deal of worry and consternation for God's people over the centuries. So we may take a look at this tomorrow, but let's read the psalm from the first verse as far as verse 18. So this is Psalm 139, and having said what I've just said, you all want to look at the end of the psalm now, don't you? Well, hold off that, and we'll do that maybe tomorrow. Psalm 139 then, and the first verse. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but look, O Lord, you know it completely. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. And if I make my bed in hell, you are there also. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, being as yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I am awake, I am still with you. Psalm 139, it's a wisdom psalm, and it has a relationship to well-being. And all of us are very used to the idea of looking after ourselves. And there's a great deal of attention being paid to how we can look after ourselves during the pandemic, and especially during lockdown. And you will have heard, as well as I've heard, about the concerns that are in society on the well-being of individuals due to the lockdown and the pandemic, especially the concern there is currently about the mental well-being of all of us passing through these difficult times. Well, it's those kind of concerns that have led me to think about well-being and to look at well-being in the Psalms. So what does Psalm 139 tell us about our well-being and how to maintain our well-being? Well, first of all, if we take a look at the Psalm itself, let's just see how many sections the Psalm divides itself into. And as you take a look at the Psalm, it seems that there are 5 divisions. And the first of them is verses 1 through to 6. And in those opening 6 verses, you have the key to well-being. So we'll take a look at that in a moment. But that's the first division of our psalm, verses 1 to 6. Then the second division is from verse 7 through to verse 12. And then the third is verse 13 to 16. And these 2 sections are a mirror image of each other. And I'll tell you more about what that means in a moment. But what you have in the second section is reflected back, but in reverse in the third section. So it's very much like looking in a mirror. The fourth section then is verses 17 and 18, which forms a kind of conclusion to what has been said. And then you've got this rather troubling 5th section. So come on, let's read it. I can see that some of you are keen to do it. So let's read this 5th section. But as I said earlier, we look at this maybe tomorrow. Here's the 5th section of the psalm then, 19 down to 24. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty man. For they speak against you, that's God, wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them as my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, for some, verses 23 and 24 form another section. So there's a 6th section, if you like. But it seems to me that verses 23 and 24 are a continuation of verses 19 onwards. So it looks to me like there are 5 sections. So I want us to start in the last verse, and in verse 23. And in verse 23, you've got the reference there to anxieties. Take a look at verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxiety. So here's the psalmist who has a whole complex, a number of anxieties. And he wants God to know them, to become aware of them. And then what the psalmist does is he seeks to address his anxieties. He seeks to look after himself through this psalm as a whole. So let's take a closer look. In the first section of the psalm, verses 1 through to 6, you have the key idea. And the key idea is knowledge. So if you want a title for Psalm 139, it's the relationship between knowledge and well-being. If you want to look after yourself as a believer in God, then the go-to place is knowledge. Now, we need to be aware of that, don't we? Because if we look after our physical health, we need to know where to go. If we are looking after our mental health, we need to know what to do. Well, here, the well-being of the psalmist, the way he's going to address his anxieties is through knowledge. And I want you to notice how many different words are used in this opening section that refer to knowledge, different knowledge-based words, okay? So verse 1, O Lord, you have searched me and know me. Verse 2, you know, and then you have the word understand. So the psalmist is laying out for us the whole collection of knowledge words that's available to him. Verse 3, you've got the word comprehend. You comprehend my path and my laying down. And then in verse 3, you are acquainted with all my ways. Verse 4, you know things altogether. You have complete knowledge. So the psalmist is reveling. He is taking joy in the different words for knowledge, and he's attributing them all to God. So the idea in this psalm is that God knows, God understands, God comprehends, God is aware, God has looked out for. So the psalmist is giving you a complete sense of the range, the extent, the nature of God's knowledge of you. So knowledge is the key, and a full knowledge, a complete knowledge, a total knowledge, a wraparound knowledge, a knowledge that surrounds the believer. That's the knowledge that God has of us. Okay? So the relationship between knowledge and well-being, God's knowledge of our anxieties. God knows, understands, comprehends. God is acquainted with our anxieties. That's what the psalmist is saying. So there's the main idea then. It's knowledge. And what you have in verses 7 to 12 is what is known as I and you knowledge. Okay? I, the psalmist, and you, God. And these verses are an exploration of the I, you knowledge that exists between the believer and God. So just take a look at the pronoun I and how often it occurs. Verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. So do you see the idea here? This whole section hangs on the idea of I and you. And what the psalmist is doing is he's thinking about himself with all his anxieties, and he's trying to imagine if there's any scenario in which he can be separated from God. So he is, if you want to imagine him in his bed or sitting down in his living room, he's trying to let his imagination discover any situation in which it would be possible for him to be separated from God. So his anxieties have led him to imagine. And that's what anxiety does. Anxiety causes our thoughts to run away. We start to imagine certain outcomes. We have certain feared outcomes. We start to imagine the worst. So if our anxiety is around our health, we start to imagine ourselves with some terrible disease from which we're going to die. In this pandemic, some people imagine themselves being ill with the virus and what that would be like. Other people imagine having to take the test, the COVID test, what that would be like. So we have a relationship between imagination and anxiety. So all of us here will have had moments when we've imagined the worst in relation to what was worrying us. Well, here is the psalmist imagining, and he is imagining different situations in which it may be possible for him to be separated from God. So take a look at the verses. Verse 7 sets up this idea. Where can I go from your spirit? And the idea is really, what can I do to separate myself from you? That's the basic idea. And so this gives us an insight into what the psalmist's anxieties are. And I don't think he's got health anxiety. And I don't think he's got social anxiety. And I don't think this guy has got financial anxiety. What he seems to be worried about is spiritual anxiety. He is anxious about his relationship with God. So he begins to think about, are there any possible outcomes in which I might end up separated from God? So look at how he imagines it all. He says, can I go to heaven? Can I descend into hell? Can I be taken away by the dawn of a new day? Or would I find the evening of another day the situation in which I might find myself separated from you? Okay, so look at what this guy is doing. He's thinking about up and down, and he's thinking about the start of a new day and the close of a day. Okay, and he's imagining everything that might go on during that day. As you take a look at verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, that's a reference to the dawn. So a new day is dawning. Is there anything about this new day that could lead me to being separated from God? Perhaps a journey, if I was to go somewhere today, if I had to travel, maybe travel to work, or if I had to travel for some other reason, could this journey result in me being separated from God? And then as he goes to verse 11, he imagines the end of a day, and he imagines going into the night. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me. So is there something that could happen during a night that could separate me from God? And of course, as he begins to imagine this and ask the question, is there any possibility at all that I should be separated from God? The answer is no. And the answer is no, because of who God is and because of what God knows. So this section concludes verses 11 and 12. Even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, this is conclusion. The darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. And that is what the psalmist discovers about the knowledge of God, that these things make no difference to God. There are differences in our experiences. So we'll have differences between the day and the night. We'll have differences between good days and bad days. We'll have good nights when we might sleep, and we'll have bad nights when we lie awake. But none of this makes any difference to God. And God's knowledge of us, the way God hedges us about, comprehends us, understands us, nothing makes the difference to God. So the answer for our psalmist in section 2 is there are no circumstances in which we can ever be separated from God because of who God is, because of his knowledge, and because of the fact that the differences in our experiences, the variables, the changeableness of our experience makes no difference to God. Okay, so that section is known as the IU section, or the IU knowledge. Now, when you come to the next part, section 3, verses 13 to 16, I told you that they are a mirror image of section 2. So if section 2 is IU, what do you think this section is? Well, section 3 is UI. It's known as the UI section. So take a look at it and you'll see it for yourself. Verse 13. For you formed me, my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, oh my God. Can you see now how we've gone to look at the other perspective? It's the you and the I. So in section 2, the psalmist wondered whether he could do anything that would have negative consequences on his relationship to God. Was there anything that might happen to him? Could he have any experiences which might lead him to being separated from God? So I, the pronoun I, was the focus in section 2. Now in section 3, verses 13 to 16, the focus is on you. The focus here is on God and what God has done and what's true of God. And in my relationship with God, what do I know about God? So the focus is not on I anymore and what might happen to me. The focus is on God. And I think that's interesting. Before we go into detail, that's interesting. Because in terms of our well-being, we'll start off by being focused on ourselves. So just any anxiety will initially present itself with the letter I. I am, I feel, I am experiencing. Can anything happen to me? So we start off being focused on ourselves, and then we think about God. Now, in the third section, a little bit of progress has been made, and now the focus is on God. And that is important to well-being. Shift your focus from the pronoun I and move your attention onto the you of God, the you of who he is and what he has done and what's true of him. And if you don't make that shift and you remain focused on I, then you're going to continue to know these anxieties. So the psalmist is very gently leading us. He starts where we are, and that's with our focus on ourselves and what might happen to us. And then, without us even realizing it, he shifted our attention off ourselves and onto God and what God has done and what God knows. And that's a very wonderful thing. And even if we forget the details of Psalm 139, let's remember this idea. Start with ourselves, yes, that's fine. Start with our anxieties, yes, that's okay. And as we are sitting there, dwelling on ourselves, we bring God into our thoughts and we bring what God knows. But then let's make that shift onto focusing, centering on God and making him the heart of our thoughts, because that's what goes on in the psalm. So let's look at section 3 then, 13 through to 16. And what is the psalmist now dwelling on? And he's dwelling on a number of ways in which God knows him. And you could break this section down into some lovely details, okay? First of all, verse 13, you formed my inward parts and you covered me in my mother's womb. Now, what the psalmist is realizing here is that he is a unique creation of God, as he is, not as he should be or as he would like to be, but actually as he has been made by God. You formed my inward parts. Now, this isn't necessarily a reference to the heart and the lungs being formed in the womb. This is the inward parts of the psalmist. So the way he's going to think, the way he's going to feel. If you want, and it's a bit of a stretch, but if you want, you can put the idea of personality here. You formed my personality. So the psalmist is somebody with anxieties. And what he is coming to see here is that God knows that he's the sort of man who struggles with anxieties, because God put together his inward parts. God has, if you like, created him to be the sort of chap who has worries. Now, he's not blaming God. He's finding comfort in the fact that God has made him the way he is. So he doesn't feel bad about the way he is. He's not going to criticize the way he is. He's finding comfort in the fact that God has made him. And if God has made him and his thoughts and his feelings, then God knows that this is who he is. And that's great. And that's fine. And then when it says in verse 13, you covered me in my mother's womb, that's not a reference there to the fact that he's in the womb and then, the mother's tummy is on the outside. He's covered by the skin of his mother. What that covering means, it's an echo back to Adam and Eve. God has made provision for the psalmist. Even from the time he was in the womb, God has made provision for this man. And God is going to provide for a man who worries. And God has provided for that from the very beginning. So it's no surprise to God that here is a psalmist who worries. In fact, God has known all along, and God has taken it into account. God has sought to look after him. God has sought from the very beginning to provide for him. This is what God knows. So verse 14, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I will praise you. There's an element here of the psalmist giving thanks for the way that he's made psychologically and emotionally. See, we tend to read this psalm as if all it's talking about is the body. And so I'm fearfully, wonderfully made. I got a brain and I got two eyes and I've got a nose and I've got a mouth, and you know how it goes. But that's not what the psalmist is only saying. He's also saying that the way he thinks and the way he feels, that's wonderful. That's wonderfully put together by God. So even his inner life, the life that causes him so much distress because he worries so much, that inner life has been put together by God. And so God knows how this man thinks. God knows what this man is prone to. God knows the weaknesses and the struggles of this man. And so he's saying to God, I praise you for that, because you know me and you know the things I struggle with, and you know the difficulties I have, and you know what I'm prone to, and you know how upset I get. I am fearfully and wonderfully put together. You've put me together like this, oh God. And if you've put me together like this, why do I need to be stressed? That's the idea, okay? My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. Now, these words, especially the word substance, have this element of the inner life, not just the outer, the body, but the inner. The very word substance means essence. It means the characteristics. So here is the psalmist understanding that God's knowledge of him is so complete because God is the one who put him together. God is the one who knitted the pattern of this man's being. And so, I mean, I don't do any knitting. Well, I used to do a little bit if I was to confess a secret. But here is this man realizing that in the pattern of his nature, God has put in black threads and grey threads and dark colors. And God has put them into the pattern of who he is. And so God knows these things. They are no surprise to him. This intimate, detailed knowledge that God has of him. Now, let me do that thing where I stop and I say, just remember the next bit, okay? Just remember this bit. In our anxieties, we are sometimes mistaken in our belief that no one understands. So we think and we say, oh, you can't understand, because here is the psalmist unable to say that, because God understands and God knows. And the reason why he knows is because he framed you. He wrote the various elements of your personality together. He has brought them into being. And so he knows you. And that's the theme then, from verse 13 down to the end of verse 16. He knows you. It's the intimate, the complete knowledge that God has of who you are, what you struggle with, what you're afraid of, what your fears are. God has this absolute knowledge of you because he framed you from the beginning. And there is this idea in this section of secrecy. So you've got the idea of hiddenness. You've got the idea of the lower parts of the earth. So what is secret to everyone else is no secret to God. So think of those, if I can ask you to do this, think of those secrets you carry about your worst fears, your darkest thoughts, your scariest moments. Those are secret from everyone else, but not from God. He knows them. And not only does he know them, he holds in compassion. So God doesn't judge. God is holding you in his knowledge, which is a compassionate knowledge. And God has put that together. So verses 13 to 16, round about the middle of verse 16, is the idea of God knowing you and holding you and his complete enfolding of you. And then right tucked at the end of verse 16, you've got this next bit, okay, verse 16. And in your book, these are my days, they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Now, this is an idea of a book, and we are familiar with this idea. And this is the book of the number of your days. And these days were written for you when as yet not one had come to pass. So not just the number of your days, as in how long will you live, but what each day will be like. Each day was set together, put together by God before any of those days was lived by you. Now, remember what we had in section 2. We had the psalmist at the start of a day wondering whether anything in that day could separate him from God. And then in the evening, he was wondering whether anything in the night could separate him from God. So he was living out these daily anxieties. So when it comes to section 3 and verse 16, the psalmist now understands that each day is the simple unfolding of what God had already purposed. So as each day opens up, it is the opening up of what God has already planned. Now, the key to verse 16 is the idea of a book. So I want you to imagine your life like a book. It's been written by God, and it was written before you were born. So this book includes the story of your creation. It includes the story of your coming into existence. So chapter 1 of the book is you being fearfully and wonderfully put together in the womb. Your body, your mind, your characteristics, your weaknesses, if you like, that's the idea, okay? And then the rest of the book is the story of your days. And it's all written. And it's written and completed before you're born. And then it's given to you, if you like, when you're born, and you live it out. So whatever you live out, whatever you encounter, whatever you experience, it has all been fashioned. Now there's the key word, guys. Look at verse 16. The days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. So if you want to be fancy, this psalmist has existential worries. What will the day bring? What could possibly go wrong? This is what he's thinking about. What are the possibilities of things going wrong? So I could, says the psalmist, go to the ends of the earth. I could go off to the highest place. I could go to the very lowest point. All of these things are possibilities that could happen and could be disastrous and could lead me to being separated from God. And it all could go so terribly wrong. And so many things could happen. But then he grounds himself. He takes his imagination down and he grounds himself into the days. And the days have already been fashioned for him. And that's the knowledge of God. As each day opens, God knows. And God knows because he's fashioned and purposed. He is established when as yet there were none of them. Now, don't get sidetracked, okay? Some of you, I think, might get sidetracked now and start thinking about things like fatalism or determinism, or you'd get all in a knot over free will and all that kind of stuff, okay? And some of you may also get into a bit of a knot here and think, well, if God has put me together in the womb and he's put my thoughts together and my personality together, does that mean I'm going to be stuck like as a worrier for the rest of my life? Don't get sidetracked into all that now, guys, okay? This psalm is dealing with one thing, and it's dealing with the relationship between me and God. I and you and I. It's the pulling together of our understanding of God's knowledge and my anxieties. Okay? So this isn't a comprehensive dissertation on human freedom. This is a specific reflection on the relationship between anxieties and knowledge, well-being and knowledge. My well-being is improved and I'm better when I focus on God's knowledge of me and God's knowledge of my days. Okay, that's simply what we're dealing with here. So let's finish with our conclusion then, 17 and 18. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, so this is the start of a new day. So do you see how the psalmist progressed? We've got a day, the dawn, in section 2. Where is it? Verse 9. Then we have the night in verse 11. And then we have a new day in verse 18. So it looks like this entire psalm has taken place over one day, and then he gets up the next day and he's feeling better. So he's had this day where he starts with worry, And then he goes into the night and he's still worrying. And then verses 13 to 16 may have perhaps taken place during the night when he can't sleep. He's put his focus on God and what he knows about God and how God knows him and how God knows his days. So he's thought about God at night. And then in verse 18, he's got a new day. And when he gets up on this new day, what does he say? When I awake, I am still with you. So the psalmist understands on day 2, if you like, that this day that's now going to unfold is that day that God has fashioned for him. That's written in the book before he was even born. That's what he's now going to experience on day 2. So whether day 2 is Monday, Wednesday he's got to go to work, Friday he's got to go to the hospital, he wakes in this new day, day 2, in the knowledge that all that will unfold is the outworking of what God has fashioned for him. How precious are your thoughts also to me, O God? How great is the sum of them? And this is the last bit here, really, for tonight. We've said that it's the relationship between anxiety and knowledge, what God knows, and what the psalmist understands is this. He's only explored 2 things that God knows. God knows him and God knows his days. But the psalmist has an insight and he sees that God knows lots of other things. In fact, God knows so many things that they are like the sand on the shore. And all this knowledge that he hasn't explored yet, these other things that God knows, suddenly become very appealing to the psalmist. They have a great attraction to the psalmist, and the psalmist wants to know what God knows. And so the psalmist is now excited to discover what else does God know. So he starts with himself, God knows me. Then he starts with his days, God has fashioned my days. God knows countless, innumerable things. How precious are the things that God knows? How vast, how complex, what an array, what a display, like the stars in the sky, is the knowledge of God. And the psalmist is suddenly overjoyed at the possibility of exploring those other realms that God may know. So you start with yourself, then your days, and then it's that sense of the psalmist getting lost in what else God knows and exploring that vast array of knowledge. So step 1 to well-being is knowledge. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's not the knowledge of ourselves, which is what you get in therapy. So therapy is all about helping you to get to know yourself a bit better and getting to know perhaps your weaknesses, getting to know your values. Therapy in our world, and that's fine, focuses its attention on us knowing ourselves. Therapy in the Psalms, well-being in the Psalms, is getting to know God and getting to know what God knows, focusing on the you of God, and then focusing on him and his knowledge. And that's a great difference between getting help in the here and now, which is great, and then the help in the Psalms. What helps us, says the psalmist, is God's knowledge of us, not our knowledge of ourselves. If we just end with this wonderful last section, do you remember I said we'd talk about it tomorrow? Well, look, here's the kind of direction to go in. The psalm starts with knowledge, then it branches out into I and you, and then it goes into you and I. Well, where does it come then? Where does it end? And where would you imagine it to end? If it's I and you and I, and then it comes together, what's it going to be? And it's going to be a little word, isn't it? and it's going to be the little word as. And that last bit has an as motif, an as theme. And that's the key to unlocking it. But there we go. First step to well-being is knowledge, and God's knowledge of us.